Hi, Michael Solis from Vantage Point Counseling. Today, what I wanted to take a little time to talk about is cheating and infidelity. This is something that we certainly work a lot with in our practice here because we do work with so much sexual compulsivity. However, it's not only sexually compulsive relationships where we see this, we also just see it, in a lot of our couples work as well. Infidelity is, a common reason that a lot of couples unfortunately end, but it really is a workable issue for a lot of them. So here's some of the advice that I lay out for people as I'm working with them on trying to repair their relationship after they have dealt with an affair or any kind of cheating. Some of the things that I remind people are that if you're in a relationship with somebody who has cheated, the hope of your relationship doesn't instantly go out of the window. A lot of times people will say things like, I never thought that this person could do this to me. And that's an understandable feeling to have. However, the person isn't completely different than who you began the relationship with. You might be face to face with a different set of circumstances, and you might be face to face with some underlying problems that you weren't aware that were there. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that the person isn't the good person that you picked to be in the relationship. It also doesn't mean that it was justifiable. It's not the fault of the person who has been cheated on. However, there are likely some other underlying issues that are going to be important for you to talk about in your relationship in order to really help it move forward. In working with people who are dealing with an affair or any kind of cheating, what I propose is that they first really learn how to talk about the issue. That can be a really hard thing to do. Emotions are flying, the emotions are really intense, and it's really hard to identify a way to be able to discuss this in a real grounded way that can work towards rebuilding connection. This is where couples therapy really can come in to kind of help both parties work through their own defensiveness and also help to communicate the contempt and anger that they have in a way that's really going to help the relationship move forward in a real positive way. The second thing that's really important is to have support. Both people need to have support. At the same time, it's important to recognize that you guys might not be able to be a support for each other in this particular situation. So if one person's really struggling with shame, one person's really struggling with anger, one person's really struggling with depression, the other person might not be able to support you through that. And that's just something at this, kind of at the early stages of cheating recovery that you really have to just kind of accept. And in time, you're more likely to rebuild trust enough to be able to be a support system for each other through anything, including this, but it's just not quite the time for that yet. So accepting that can be a really important part of it. So instead, finding, friends or family who are going to be really a kind of a grounding force, who are not going to judge you for having the feelings that you're having about it, and who aren't going to judge you or criticize you for having cheated. For the person who's been cheated on, if you're really wanting to make the relationship work, surrounding yourself by people who are not going to necessarily enable you to allow it to happen again, however, at the same time, who are not going to treat your partner like the spawn of Satan. It's not going to be helpful for you based on the goals that you're establishing if they treat your partner or they really come down on your partner constantly to you, because you're going to start to take some of that on because you're already feeling a lot of negative emotion around it. So focusing on setting some boundaries with them about, hey, this is actually what I need. What I need is just to have you hear me out, just to allow me to have the emotions that I have about it, and not to judge me for having those emotions. For the person who's had the affair, who's cheated, it's important to have support as well. This support really needs to be friends or family who are not also going to shame you for this. However, you want to be careful so that you are not surrounding yourself with people who are putting it on your partner and saying that your partner didn't give you the kind of sex that you want, or that your partner's not attractive enough, or you're better. Those type of things are not going to help you facilitate the goal of rebuilding your relationship. And the third thing that is probably the most significant thing is identifying together the underlying problems that could have influenced having an affair, or having cheated. Now, this doesn't mean that it's anybody's fault, but there are likely underlying factors. It could be underlying factors of dissatisfaction. It could be poor boundaries. It could be a lackluster sex life. It could be a number of issues. And so being able to work together to unpack that, to identify how this could have happened, is a really critical piece to preventing it from happening again. Most people don't think that they're going to get into a relationship, a monogamous relationship, and end up cheating on the other person. A lot of times it ends up happening unexpectedly. And so to have a good understanding about this means that there's got to be a lot of exploring that happens. And sometimes this means working with a therapist on this to be able to unpack what happened. Finally, what I want to say is that, relationships are hard, and cheating does happen. Only you can decide, though, if it's something that you can live with or not. And so that's not something that anybody else can tell you that you have to live with, that you have to move forward, that you have to try to make this relationship work. It's also not something that means that you have to leave. And so if you are trying to figure this out, it is good to get the feedback from other people. However, get a variety of opinions and get a variety of perspectives on it, and that can help you really decide for yourself what is the most appropriate thing that you want to do, if you want to work on this, or if you feel like it's an important thing to move on from. If you do decide that it's something that you want to work on, it is a workable issue. It does take time to rebuild that trust, and to rebuild that sense of commitment in the relationship. And so know that it is going to be a journey, but it is something that you can work on.